By proclamation of the royal ministry, the king is entitled to get whatever he wants.
This isn't fair.
Life isn't fair, pal. Get used to it.
Cue the intro! Ahoy, mateys, and welcome aboard to I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast, where the only dumb rule I could have for you is to make you go to youtube.com/@thecaptaineric and hit subscribe, but it's not a rule, so therefore it's not dumb. We don't have to talk about that anymore. But anyway, welcome aboard to another episode. Today's episode is Rule of Dumb, and we are continuing our sail through the 4th season of SpongeBob SquarePants. This episode was another serving of Patrick. We had a two-parter here where Patrick was in charge. Patrick was not only ruling the show, ruling the episode, but quite literally in this episode, ruling Bikini Bottom upon hearing of some lineage he has, or that his family is a part of royalty. Though comparing last week's episode to this one is a little unfair. We'll do the whole comparing of episodes at the end of the season, but looking at these two episodes where Patrick gets to win, where life finally hands Patrick a W, it feels like the first episode fell more in line with who Patrick is as a character. And this episode, I think, although has a great allegory of a story here about what happens when those in power go off the rails, I'm not going to deny that that's a great story on its own. But between the two, this episode really takes the character of Patrick and stretches it out in places we've never seen. He literally becomes a monster in this episode. I even wrote in my notes, there was a line and moment in this episode where I think this is the meanest I have ever seen Patrick star. And there have been times where he has shown anger, he has become aggressive, but to go the extra level and to actually become almost evil in a way, is that a statement on just power overall? Can it corrupt anybody? No, I don't think so. I really don't think so at all. There is a phrase that comes alongside power, and although it is cliche at this point, it is a very thoughtful phrase. With great power comes great responsibility. I'm not an uncle. Gotta watch out for any suspecting criminals out and about. You never know. I'm not a Ben either, so I don't know what I'm worried about. But with great power comes great responsibility, and at the end of the day, what that comes down to is whether or not how selfish you are in that moment. When you have that much power, it's your selfishness that is going to take you in many different directions. And certainly those who are vulnerable, who may not be selfish inherently, but open to doing things to get where they want to go. I'm thinking of Doc Ock. I'm kind of sticking in the Spider-Man realm, but we have to swing back over to the SpongeBob side. But regardless, SpongeBob is a character that is not inherently selfish. He has flaws. Certainly. We've talked about him on this podcast, but he's not a selfish character. SpongeBob would give the last clam he has in his pocket to somebody who needs it. He would give a quarter to Patrick for something he knows is going to be wasteful, but SpongeBob would do it. He's a character that you could give power such as being king of Bikini Bottom. And yes, that is something that comes up in this episode as apparently a thing. But he's a character that you can hand that crown to and you really wouldn't see any problems with. Almost every other side character on this show, you could hand that crown to, and it is a recipe for disaster. Patrick would be a recipe for disaster in ways that I was not suspecting this episode would go. If you asked me, going to the jumping off point of the episode, Patrick is told that he is a part of royalty, he is the next in line, he is therefore king, and has at least one individual at his beck and call, although SpongeBob steps in to take that place. Going off of there, and especially under the title Rule of Dumb, which is a play on words of a classic phrase known as the rule of thumb, which is a broadly accurate guide of principle based on experience or practice rather than theory. So someone's rule of thumb usually is a lot more personal to them than what yours might be. Something that you'll go by till the day you die. Something that you already have experience on. Nobody is going to tell you otherwise. And when it comes to being dumb in the world of SpongeBob SquarePants, it's not really, I don't want to say it in a condescending way, because being dumb and being silly eventually got Patrick Star his own show. So who am I to judge? But being dumb has always been a part of Patrick Star. It's who he is. And unfortunately, we find out a lot more as to why that is in this episode. We know a lot more about Patrick's family that we unfortunately have to get into. But what I would think going into this is lean into that dumb part of Patrick. What things as a ruler of Bikini Bottom, what credences does Patrick Star come up with? And unfortunately, we don't get to see any of that. We just see the monster that was created upon the ruling of King Star. Rule of Dumb is the second half of the 77th episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, and it first premiered in the world, in the UK, in Ireland, all over in Europe on November 22nd, 2006, before premiering on DVD, I think on the Season 4, Volume 2 DVD, which released on January 9th, 2007 here in the States. It made its TV premiere on February 19th, 2007, before making its Canadian air date on April 25th, 2007. Now, I am certainly wrong about the all over Europe part, because certainly there are parts of Europe that didn't get this episode until later on or even earlier. November 4th, 2006, this first premiered in Germany. Would you look at that? So you learn something new every day. This episode was storyboard directed by Zeus Service and Eric Weiss, who also wrote this episode alongside Danny McKillie. Our animation director is Tom Yasumi, our technical director is Vincent Waller, and our supervising producer is Paul Tibbett. Right out of the gate, I'll give a good title card credit where credit is due. I love the crown designs right behind the Rule of Dumb moniker. Gives you at least somewhat of an idea of what we're in for of the episode. So I can appreciate that on that front, while also being a clever little play on words. So bravo. And as the episode kicks off, we see something that we're really not used to in SpongeBob SquarePants. It's something of a rarity. It's something of a special occasion where we have another sea star present as a separate character. This is incredibly rare as far as I'm concerned. I know in Season 1, Squidward went back in time and met a prehistoric starfish. I get that. In Season 2, we met Patrick's parents, which we end up finding out their names in this episode, and we'll get to that later on. And then in Season 3, we had furthering adventures of a prehistoric starfish, although I'm now remembering another starfish that we encountered in the chocolate with nuts episode when Patrick was selling the chocolate to someone to cure their ugliness. You won't be as ugly as you look, and it ends up being somebody who looks exactly like him. And honestly, with what we find out in this episode, that very well could be a sibling of Patrick's. And I'm not joking about that. This may need to be a theory that is looked into, although knowing the internet, knowing how many content creators get into this space, not even just of theories, just into this world of YouTube and podcasting, there already could be someone who has mapped out the possible family members. But as far as I'm concerned, with the information I've seen in this episode, any starfish is on the table, including this one, who ends up wanting to deliver Patrick some news. Patrick has one of the best introductory lines that I can think of in the show's history, of when he opens up his rock to notice this other starfish. His monotoned yeah of answering the door is so perfect. I don't know how that was written, or if Bill just, that's how his delivery was, but for some reason I will say that is just so pitch perfect. And there's so many little moments in this episode that felt there was extra little detail thrown on or extra effort put in, and I do appreciate that. So I don't want to make this seem like, although there will be a point that I have to say I think they take a turn here, but there are moments of this episode I genuinely love. So Patrick's yeah here, I know it's small and it's quick, but even those moments are memorable, let me tell you. So on top of seeing this other sea star, Patrick immediately becomes frantic, wants to get out of the house, wants to escape. And although we get to see SpongeBob watching the most interesting drama that we can see, and although this drama that's happening in SpongeBob's world pales in comparison to what is going on within Patrick's family history, that is something that deserves its own reality show.
Reality is often disappointing.
SpongeBob is sitting down with Gary to watch a cheesy soap opera with some lover, and he's losing his girlfriend to his grandfather, which I know that already is a bit cringe sounding, and you're like, that doesn't happen. There are those out there naive enough to think that doesn't happen, but unfortunately, in the world we live in, that happens. That happens. And it's not even as young to old as it's presented as in this episode. It could be somebody in their 40s or 30s. So something you wouldn't even expect. But that kind of stuff unfortunately happens. I don't know firsthand, but I'm just telling you, in the sea of the internet, I have seen islands passing by that you go, wow, that's happening. That Dr. Phil Island over there will show you some real weird stuff. Don't dock on that over there. So, trust me. But anyway, that drama pales in comparison to what's happening with Patrick's family. And Patrick literally comes through the television, must have dug his way a tunnel through the ground, which, honestly, given that Patrick lives underground, I have no idea why they haven't had this idea in the first place of making a tunnel in between their homes, which I think happens in a later episode. Hold on. Wait a minute. SpongeBob. Yeah, because, wait a minute. Squidward's house definitely ends up underground in an episode where, yes, they're digging a tunnel in between their homes. So, I completely, that sinking feeling will eventually get to you. But I had forgotten about that episode entirely when Patrick had made his way into SpongeBob's house. When he came through the TV, my first thought was, why haven't they made a tunnel in between their homes? permanently, like a decent one. Although, we'll find out what happens when SpongeBob and Patrick actually try that. But Patrick ends up coming right through SpongeBob's television, freaking out over this sea star that is over at his house, who Patrick thinks is a librarian here to pick up either the books that he has held on to or is looking for Patrick to pay his book fees. And it looks like Patrick is taking a page out of the books of people in 2023, starts a fire, and starts burning all of the books that he has held on to from the library, which just, I know overdraft fees and overdue fees, totally separate things, but overdue fees, more associated with the library. I know they suck, both of them, not pleasant experiences at all, but if you hold on to something for a little bit too long, return it and pay a little bit to the library. It's not like they're making a ton of money. So that's kind of where they end up, having that revenue come through is when you're late with your books and you pay that fee. I'm sure there's other means by their respective states where they get paid, but still, it's a pretty decent service for your town, and hey, that's a part of the penalty. You sign up for the card, that's a part of the penalty. But Patrick would rather burn his copies of Richard Salmon's Guide to Fitness instead of just handing the books back or paying his fees, although we're not told how long Patrick has had these books for, and it's not like the minister here ends up actually being the library. Richard Salmon here is a play on Richard Simmons, one of the most well-known names in home video fitness, and I think just fitness in general. I absolutely love the energy and the positivity of Richard Simmons, and his sudden disappearance from the public eye and those he worked with certainly left an impact that is still felt to this day. And I hope wherever he is, at home, that he's doing well, that he's feeling good, and that he's sweating to the oldies. I absolutely love Richard Simmons. I'm not saying that that's my preferred method of fitness, but his energy is infectious. When he enters the room and he's on, when it's Richard Simmons, you can't help but smile and move around a little bit with him. So I gotta say, I said Salmon at first. Richard Salmon probably brings that same infectious energy under the water. And it's not even the first time that Richard Simmons has been parodied in a Nickelodeon show. One of my favorite side characters in a Nickelodeon show is an episode of Rocko's Modern Life that features a caricature of sorts of Richard Simmons, which in the late 90s, more of an appropriate parody time for him. But here in 2006, I still love it. There's never a bad time for a Richard Simmons call-out.
This is my favorite game. How about you all?
I'm not sure what is going on behind the scenes, but between the last episode where SpongeBob actually had to spend some time within jail, and in this episode, Patrick mentioning the small portion sizes in the big house, there's a lot of jail talk increasing on SpongeBob SquarePants, and even characters actually having to spend time in the big house. Just something interesting I noticed while I was watching this episode. As SpongeBob agrees to go out and talk to this supposed librarian, he ends up finding out that this gentleman is actually a minister on behalf of the royal family here to deliver something to Patrick Star, although SpongeBob pretends to not know who Patrick is out of fear that it's still some sort of negative thing going on to happen to Patrick. Once Patrick notices the crown that was to be given to him, he breaks a hole right through SpongeBob's wall and immediately accepts this gift. I mean, it isn't every day that something is delivered like this for Patrick, so it's a nice win for him, including his earning of a driver's license in the previous episode, and then this sign of royalty. This little moment here, it's nice to appreciate this little time of Patrick's wins on SpongeBob SquarePants. We soon find out from the minister that Patrick is the next in a long line of royalty to wear the crown. And it's time for us to get the elephant out of the room. Talk about the elephant. What? Oh, come on. I was joking. It was a Come on. I misspoke. The phrase is talk about the elephant in the room. Okay, come on. All right. Well, regardless if you're trying to get the elephant out of the room or talk about the elephant in the room, there is an elephant in the room that we have to talk about here, and it's not even something that I want to talk about. It's the minister's fault. It's something he brought up, and it's the fact that Patrick comes from a family that has inbreeding in it. Now, we're not going to get into any specifics here. This is not the time, place, nor am I the person that wants to discuss anything like that. But the act of inbreeding, factually, is when those within a gene pool, the same family gene pool, have a child. And regardless on your moral opinions or anything like that, scientifically, it is a danger to the birth, the life, and for that human being for a number of ailments that can come up from inbreeding. And unfortunately, regardless, it does answer a little bit as for some of Patrick's intelligence here, but if you come from a family of inbreeding, there may be those out there all over the world that could trace at least one part of their family where something may have happened. And if you come from a family like that, even Patrick, nothing to be ashamed of. You are who you are. It's about what you currently bring to the world, not about how your creation came about and your family history, but it's about you now. Who are you? What do you bring? So, Patrick, it doesn't matter where that inbreeding may have happened, but we can clearly see on this family tree that it started out with beautifully King Amoeba and Queen Mildew. The fact that these single-celled organisms are at the top of this chart always makes me laugh. They had what appears to be 4 children. Now, I originally thought 3, but then there was a specific connection here with Yorick. Yorick seems to be a child, possibly, of King Amoeba and Queen Mildew. Out of these 3 kids, though, there's only 3 of them, out of the 4 kids, there's only 3 of them that have official royal titles. There's Prince Dingus, Prince Callus, and Princess Tulsa. Right next to the princess, though, there is also a character by the name of Yorick, who seems to be a court jester, who may also, just by the look of this diagram and the way it's presented, may also be a child of King Amoeba and Queen Mildew. But regardless, one little piece of trivia here is that the name Yorick is actually the name of another court jester in a play by a little-known playwright. You may have heard of him, William Shakespeare. Well, in this play, if I'm not mistaken, it is Yorick's skull, which is later on exhumed from his grave, and a character holds the skull in their hand, and it's one of the most well-known cliches associated with William Shakespeare, is holding of the skull and reciting something insightful or what have you. But that skull, if I'm not mistaken, is Yorick. But either way, it's a character in a play called Hamlet. So Yorick and Princess Tulsa had a child by the name of Ma Tucket. Now, Ma Tucket found her way to a gentleman known by Billy Bob, and they had what appears to be at least one child, Sluggo, a little slug-looking creature, but Billy Bob is also connected to another kid. Now, is this kid the product of Ma Tucket and Billy Bob? I'm not sure. The way that the tree is aligned, it seems like Billy Bob may be the father of this character alongside Ma Tucket, but it also may be from a previous relationship and they just don't know where that connection is. But either way, Billy Bob is the grandfather of Patrick Star. He is the father of Herb Star, who eventually found himself the beautiful Margie Star, and the two of them had Patrick Star. Now, in this family tree, in this history, I can't really tell you exactly where the inbreeding took place. There's also another character on this page I should bring up. It's fair to bring up that Prince Callus and Prince Dingus may have adopted an individual by the name of Carl, who by those glasses and just the overall shape of the head reminds me of the caricature of one C.H. Greenblatt, Carl Greenblatt, the creator of Chowder, Harvey Beaks, and one of the biggest writers in SpongeBob SquarePants history. So I feel like that might be a little sly call-out to one C.H. Greenblatt. But this family tree here is really interesting. This is the most we have ever seen of any character's family. And on top of that, to be able to finally have first names for Patrick's parents, who up to this point were unnamed. We only knew of Janet and Marty. Even up to that point, we knew them as just Patrick's mom and Patrick's dad. Then eventually we find out their first names. Oh wait, we don't even have kids. Then they're just random starfish that we know that go off into the distance. And then Patrick's real parents come in. We don't find out their names until this episode. That's really cool. I enjoy little world building like that. And this family tree is something we're going to have to come back to because, as we know, Patrick's family is certainly not the easiest to keep track of. But even in this episode, we'll come back to this.
Are you sure about that?
After finding out that he's the next in line for this crown, the minister tells him that he's basically at his beckoning call, or the ministry, wherever he's going back to, and he leaves. And there isn't necessarily anything said about what Patrick has to do or what his duties or responsibilities are. It's not even said that he's the king of Bikini Bottom. It's just this weird man that enters the space, gives Patrick a crown, lets him know that he comes from royalty, and then leaves. He does say, anything you need, I can get you. But Patrick doesn't need that guy because he has SpongeBob, who is more than willing to dress the part of the sidekick, the second in command for the king. I don't know what that name would be in medieval times. Let me look that up. Would be like the king's right-hand man. Right-hand man. We're doing research on the spot. The Chancellor, or the Chief Minister. Oh. Well, I like Chancellor. Chancellor SpongeBob. It's got a nice ring to it. Chief Minister SpongeBob. I feel like that's a lot more. We'll go with Chancellor for this time around. SpongeBob all decked out in a purplish gear, which purple is always associated with royalty. I recently watched a video of the amount of times in media purple is used for royal characters. I mean, I knew of it to some regard, but there were so many examples of the use of that color for cartoon characters and costumes and movies and TV shows, things that I completely wasn't even thinking about in the time of watching it. In something like this, it isn't shocking to see SpongeBob and then Patrick adorning the classic king robe with the fur trim on the side, has his crown, and SpongeBob is decorating everywhere this man walks with petals. He is announcing to the town of Bikini Bottom as they enter the Krusty Krab, "The king of Bikini Bottom is here!" And the king enters, which you would think of all characters in this town to get Mr. Krabs to pull the red carpet legitimately out for, Patrick would be one of the last characters. I know that he eats there a lot and definitely spends a lot of money, but Mr. Krabs, I think, is off his rocker a little bit, along with SpongeBob. I get that SpongeBob would want to have the attitude of being the chancellor for the king, but to dress the part and go above and beyond like this is a crazy thing to do, along with Mr. Krabs, who upon seeing the crown, I do have to note this, for as much as I think Mr. Krabs is a little bit off his rocker in this episode, that is something I need to point out. I think Mr. Krabs, for as greedy as he is, does have the ability to zero in on really expensive items. When real gold enters the room, I think he knows. So this crown is the real deal. And when Mr. Krabs checks that thing out, he just loses the thought process of who's wearing it, because it's a real crown. It's a legitimate gold, diamond encrusted, or ruby, emeralds, it's a real crown inside of his restaurant. So by all means, he wants to please whoever's wearing that. It doesn't even matter at that point that it's Patrick. I don't even think he thinks, oh wait, it's Patrick Star wearing that. It's SpongeBob coming in. Remember Bubble Buddy? What's going to happen? Same thing. Almost the same thing, essentially. But a little bit of a twist here, as Mr. Krabs rolls out the red carpet in the style of a full buffet for Patrick. Clearly not a all-you-can-eat buffet. An all-you-can-eat buffet, proper grammar. It is a pay-by-burger buffet. And when Patrick is all done, he hands Patrick the bill. "Here you go, sire. This is your bill." Patrick hands the bill over to SpongeBob, and SpongeBob politely reminds Mr. Krabs that the king of Bikini Bottom actually doesn't really need to pay for anything. Everything's free. He can have whatever he wants, and it's in some sort of paperwork that they have. Mr. Krabs, at the hearing of the word free, freaks out, as he should, and kicks the king and the chancellor right out of the Krusty Krab. It's funny for him to kick them out, but if he agrees that the kingship is real and he has to abide by the fact that the king can have whatever he wants, in some way he's then acknowledging that Patrick is the king, and here he is just kicking the king out of his restaurant. And there's nothing that he has to pay for that for, or is reprimanded. If you believe that he's king enough to go by the fact that all of this is free, which I don't think Mr. Krabs really did by kicking them out, but you would think that the fact that SpongeBob works for him and is bringing Patrick in, I mean, essentially it was Mr. Krabs who wooed him with the food. I don't know, weird situation. I don't think it was right for SpongeBob and Patrick to lie like that. That's the one part that I'm not sure of. Did they make that up? Did the two of them make that up before going in? Not intentionally just for the Krusty Krab. Is it an actual rule? Or did they make it up? Or did Patrick just say, I get everything for free, and SpongeBob just drafted up some sort of decree by the king? Everything is free. He gets everything he wants. And just as it starts, Patrick grabs a burger and a soda out of another patron's hand as they're walking away. He was kicked out of the Krusty Krab. He's not allowed to go in to get a burger. Fine, I'm taking yours. And once SpongeBob reminds this guy, he just scoots off. A lot easier than I think most people would take that kind of situation if somebody was going to flat out grab a burger and a soda out of your hands. To just say, ha, this is mine now. I don't think most people would walk away that easily. Now, I know that this is a 12-minute or so cartoon, but I'm not nitpicking. I promise you. I really think at the end of the day that this episode is one of the best episodes of an allegory for those parents who have kids that they never say no to. And what happens when you are finally presented in situations where you have to say no, and the kind of monster that can come out of that, or even beforehand. Those times that you try to say no, and then things go out of control, off the rails, and then you agree, which is only just resetting the time bomb that you yourself have created. I'm not going to sit here and try to parent the parents, but no is a healthy part of life, because even if you say yes to your kid up until the age of 18, the second that they're out into the real world, I'm sorry, no is a word you're going to hear a lot of. Sorry for the yelling. A lot of sorries here. Regardless, this whole episode feels like that was at least the jumping off point for those kids who just get whatever they want, and then what happens when they can't get it, and they throw attitudes, and they get angry at people, or you just have that kind of course there's that whole power dynamic of those who get in power and then become engrossed by it, and it takes them over. Mad with power, it's a real thing. And right after stealing a burger and soda from one fish, here comes another fish who finally has completed his Wonder Space Fish collection, his comic book collection of the superhero Wonder Space Fish. Number 2. Issue 2 is the one that eluded him the most, which is really interesting. You would think issue 1 would be the elusive comic book, but I honestly think it's a little bit more realistic for a random number other than number 1 to be the missing grail to this collection. But he's been working hard towards this, and, you know, I have to be honest with you, as a collector, there is a genuine enjoyment that comes from completing a collection that you have been working hard towards. I am not necessarily the biggest comic book collector in the world, but when there's a short run of something, when there's only like 5 issues, and it may be hard to go after, when you finally complete it, there is a genuine good feeling about that. And it's the same feeling of finishing any puzzle, finishing a game, finishing a book, completing something, putting an end to a means. It's great. It's a great feeling. Unfortunately, for as good as this must be feeling, he is about to run into a typhoon known as King Patrick Star. The second this fish is in front of Patrick, Patrick grabs the comic books in what I wrote is maybe one of the meanest things Patrick has legitimately done and said up to this point on the show. End quote. Patrick just grabs this guy's collection of comic books and just, they're mine, for absolutely no reason, and is showing clear aggression over the idea of just, give me this, this is mine. And that's not even a fraction of the aggression that Patrick betrayed, but the unmitigated entitlement that this character has in this moment is unbelievable. real. It is wild to see. We have never had Patrick at this level before. As far as I can remember, I mean, I've been watching an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants every week. 3 seasons in a movie. We're in the 4th season right now, and I legitimately can't think up to this point of a time that there are moments in Valentine's Day where Patrick goes ballistic. He has those capabilities of scaring a group of people. That may be the closest, but for this is targeted anger. This is targeted aggression. This is so different in my eyes than the massacre of the pier on Valentine's Day. That episode to me is like the Pebble in Ed's shoe episode of Ed, Edd and Eddy. Ed is one of the most lovable characters in the world, and he has an episode where for the entire episode there is a pebble in his shoe, unbeknownst to his friends, and he is angry and has a dark cloud hanging above him throughout this entire day, while his friends try to cheer him up and get him out of this funk and force him out of it, and he is just battering them and breaking things and is a massive destructive force of nature. Nothing in this world is of Ed from Ed, Edd and Eddy when he has a stone or a pebble in his shoe. But once that's unveiled and you understand that there was something at the heart of all of this aggression, you kind of forgive all of it. And in the same way, during that Valentine's Day episode, Patrick has this moment of real grief, this misunderstanding of a gift from SpongeBob causing him to have this emotional outburst. And the second that it's over, everything is kind of water under the bridge, at least for me. But this moment is a little different. It feels a little different. There isn't a part of this episode that has that pebble out of the shoe moment, has the balloon finally showing up moment. There is Patrick eventually getting rid of this, but it's different. This is the angriest, this is the meanest that we have ever had Patrick star. And it's not the idea of stealing one's comic book collection. Of course, they build up the idea that this is something that this individual has spent years building upon. So I'm not even saying it just has to be that. It could have been anything. It's the way that Patrick comes across, which goes right into the further rule of King Patrick Star as he converts his rock into a castle, a legitimate underground castle, a throne, an underground pool, which is hilarious, of course. They're underwater. I wonder if it's the goo from Goo Lagoon inside of that pool. But right outside of this castle is a lineup of seemingly every citizen in Bikini Bottom, each of them with an item in their hands, a gift for the king, as it seems Patrick has put out an APB, an all citizens alert, to bring an item of some sort to the king. It seems really weird that a single piece of paper coming from SpongeBob and Patrick Star would convince everybody. All of these fish now believe that they have to give up their items to this king. Is it the crown? Because I gave that excuse to Mr. Krabs over his ability of knowing the crown was real and taking that seriously, but I don't get it. I know that these fish aren't the smartest in the world, but you would think with SpongeBob and Patrick, they would go, you know what? I don't think that's a real king. I don't think these guys are legit. I'm shocked that this many people have fallen into this. Or it's a legitimate piece of paper. Patrick has legitimate power. It's legitimate rule. I have no idea. But there is one thing I know. And it's that Squidward has always been the vessel for parents and adults out there who find SpongeBob annoying to be their spirit animal through this journey. Squidward is the adult in the room at all times, for good and for bad. And it's Squidward waking up from his hibernation, because I think he's missed a few episodes, or at least a couple of SpongeBob and Patrick shenanigans. I think he was absent last episode, and I think I even mentioned maybe he's in a deep sleep knowing that Patrick was ruining SpongeBob's day by gaining his license, so he decided to take an extra long nap. But he feels extra refreshed until he not only notices all of these people outside, but it's his house that's being moved as Patrick is now planning an entirely new part of his castle on his front lawn, which is where Squidward's house used to be. Now, Squidward enters the arena of this situation with all of these people lined up, all of these construction workers and their equipment, Patrick, Chancellor SpongeBob, and the adult in the room finally showed up. Who in their right mind is going to believe that this guy is a king? You guys all fell for this? And I have to be honest with you. Squidward in this situation, I have felt like that before when it comes to my family and news articles from The Onion in 2023. Really? Still? You guys believed this? Or with any news that is clearly fake? My mother used to be someone on Facebook who would fall for every single hoax of a celebrity death that would come out every other day. Oh my goodness, did you hear about somebody passing away? And then I would ask, did you double check TMZ or a reputable source for that kind of news? And then we would find out it was fake. Until, the few times that she was actually right about it. But I'm telling you, it was like a 10% chance that the celebrity she was talking about had actually deceased. So that's how I feel sometimes when it comes to the internet and the way people utilize it. We can all feel like Squidward. When there's a massive group of people who've believed something, and then you have to be the one to step in the room going, I can't believe you believed this. I actually had no plan whatsoever for that to play, and I thought I deleted any of the previous sound effects from last week, but that's going to stay in. That actually scared me. I didn't even say anything that cool to deserve that group. But, man, that really sent me off the rails for a second. I thought my computer was blowing up for a second. I have my headphones on, and that came out of nowhere because I don't even have that track on frame on my screen. So, yeesh. I'll have to make sure not to have any of those on again. There are so many moments in this show, not even this episode particularly, where you can feel like Squidward. The older you get, the more you will find you feel like Squidward. Every little minute, every little hour, every little day, you'll start feeling a little bit more like Squidward. But if you're like me and you can still tap into that SpongeBob part of your creativity and your imagination, then that's wonderful. Things won't be as miserable day to day. Don't let that Squidward part take over. But Squidward pretty much takes control of the room. Everybody starts actually listening into what he's saying, and you know what? Why are we here? Why are we doing everything for free for this guy? Why are we giving him our stuff?
He's got a point.
The scare meter of Patrick's star has been turned up to 11, as it's this outburst of Squidward that then turns Patrick's anger, aggression, and entitlement into legitimate violence, as he sends SpongeBob to attack Squidward for his defiance of his power, or his rule. And I'm sounding a lot calmer than Patrick is drawn or shown in this situation, but it still is. This aggression is building. It's building towards something we'll get to. But SpongeBob is starting to feel hesitant at this situation over the king he's helped build up and promote. He walks over to Squidward, doesn't attack him, tries to get him to sign this treaty. Of course, I'm glad Squidward doesn't. We then cut inside of the castle where King Patrick is unloading on his chancellor. He feels frustrated. He has now lost all of these people. He's lost all of these subjects. Nobody listens to him. He has what I would say is one of the biggest rants of power I have seen in a cartoon almost ever. There have been some lustful characters for power that have had monologues before that could rival this, but maybe it's a recency bias. But if you can think of any other rants of power like this that could challenge King Patrick, I would certainly love for you to send me those examples at spongepodpodcast@gmail.com. That is the official email for the show, spongepodpodcast@gmail.com. If you ever have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the show, you can drop them there. But this rant here is certainly one for the ages. For how negative this episode may have made me feel about Patrick, I'll give them credit. If the point was to build to this absolute monster of power instead of just having Patrick's dumb rule kind of collapse in on itself, which is legitimately an episode I would still love to see. I would love to see Patrick in charge, in some sort of position of power, the mayor, and then what does he decree? What laws does he put into place? Because, I don't know, I feel like that is a nice little allegory to certain things going on in certain areas of our world. I'll let you think of that what you will. But, of course, somebody in a position of power, not that intelligent, writes for itself. But Patrick here, it's not that it's his unintelligence that is driving this current position of power. It is his aggression that has taken over, his strength, more than anything else. He certainly has become that Norman Osborn, not to go back to the Spider-Man stuff. We always go back full circle here, but going back to Doc Ock, Green Goblin, these characters that are good-natured characters. They have good souls. They seemingly have good purposes for what they want to do. But then there's that turn, and that power courses through their body, and it takes their aggression, and it dials it up. And Patrick's no different here, except for he doesn't have any sort of dangerous powers, but he certainly is a monster, even making SpongeBob go, you know what? I don't want to have any more of this. And even though he leaves, he does have to take some responsibility for helping to build this monster up. It is SpongeBob who dressed himself up. Patrick, I guarantee you, did not ask for SpongeBob to dress himself up in that Chancellor purplish outfit, bring out any sort of decorations or announcements for King Patrick. That was all SpongeBob. SpongeBob helped build up the current monster that Patrick has in front of him today, as once SpongeBob is gone, Patrick is only left for himself. He only has himself to talk to, and when he sees that reflection of himself in the mirror, he then sees the monster that he has become. Something that very much the design of this monster Patrick reminds me of Bowser a little bit with the spikes on the back. But this caricature of how Patrick sees himself is a little jarring. It's a little scary. It's something you don't see in SpongeBob every single episode. But I think it's a nice little moment for Patrick a nice little scare, because the sight of this monster, seeing himself like this, scares him to the point that he does not want to be the king anymore. He does not want this responsibility. He runs out of the castle and he finds the minister heading back over to Conch Street once again. And before he gets even a single word out, Patrick hands back the crown. He doesn't want any of this responsibility. He doesn't want the royalty. Please take this back. Which is okay, because in fact, the minister was coming back to retrieve the crown as they made a mistake. They missed another member on that family tree to give that crown to. There is somebody else before Patrick that deserves that crown, and it's under Sluggo, the slug, the son of Ma Tucket and Billy Bob, who had themselves Sluggo, who had himself a child, a little mollusk known as Gary. Gary the snail is in fact the next in line for this royalty, and wouldn't you know it, this family tree confirms that Patrick Star and SpongeBob's pet Gary are in fact first cousins. Wow, it's pretty crazy. Now, even though Gary and Patrick may be on the same level of the tree, it may be the case that Sluggo was the firstborn between Ma Tucket and Billy Bob, if they also had Herb Star, or if Billy Bob had Herb with somebody else. Like I said, the way it's drawn is not really specific to say that Ma Tucket is the legitimate grandmother of Patrick Star, but that may be the case as well. It's a put-together family tree for an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. Nothing too serious that we have to look into, but something interesting. Something certainly interesting, to say the least. This episode is certainly interesting, and I'm bummed out that by the end of this episode there really wasn't any sort of comeuppance for Patrick, or there wasn't any sort of other moment of him to have any sort of clarity with the citizens of Bikini Bottom. It's like he takes all their stuff, they help build him a castle under his rock that I know disappears after this episode, but for the sake of the context of this episode, it's not like there's any sort of demolishing of the castle interior. For all intent and purposes, if he wanted to, Patrick could absolutely just keep that interior, that swimming pool in his house, although who knows what the maintenance of an indoor Goo Lagoon style swimming pool is like in Bikini Bottom. But it's not like they took all of that stuff back. They just all walked away. And although Patrick does have that moment with himself in the mirror to discover the monster he's become, he doesn't have any sort of other moment with any other character about coming back down to earth and having that talk. It's just kind of swept under the rug. He runs out of the rock and immediately runs into the minister, finds out Gary is the real heir to the crown, and then we immediately cut to Gary being handed the crown, SpongeBob and Patrick now dressed in these purple chancellor outfits, alongside the minister himself, who seems very pleased upon this person they are making the king, and Gary also seems pleased himself. That is Rule of Dumb, and although there are parts of this episode that I would personally do differently, there are parts of the story I would like to see go in different ways upon a revisit to the idea of Patrick in power. And although there are negative parts of some certain character aspects in this episode, I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed the episode on its own, and I do genuinely think that this is a great episode that showcases what happens when you have someone that you don't say no to. It doesn't even have to be a kid. Trust me when I say that there are adults out there who can't even handle hearing the word no after 30 or 40 or 50 years. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be directed towards a child, but you do have those kids who never hear the word no, and then they end up a little bit like King Patrick in this episode, and then the parents end up like Chancellor SpongeBob. Or they end up like Squidward. I don't know. Don't end up like a Squidward out there.
No, don't do it. No.
And that is going to be it for this week's I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. Thank you for coming aboard. You make this show all the worthwhile. I enjoy your company, and it's a pleasure producing this episode week after week. This series, week after week. It's a part of my routine, and having you come aboard is always a pleasure. Thank you for being my sponge buddy, my battle buddy for this adventure. If you would like to write into the captain, there are a few means of communication. One, I already mentioned in this episode, spongepodpodcast@gmail.com, but you can also find the captain on Twitter @I'mReadyPodcast and on Instagram @SpongeBobPodcast, as simple as you can get. Mwah. If you would like to support the captain, there are two ways that you can do so, the best of which is by subscribing to the Captain Eric YouTube channel, youtube.com/@TheCaptainEric. The other means is by clicking on that Redbubble link in the podcast description below, where you can find a bunch of different pieces of art that I've designed myself that you can put on a multitude of different products. Anything from stickers to a hat to a t-shirt, anything that comes in from my projects go directly back into my projects, and it is always appreciated. Now, I usually have a way that I end my podcasts, and it's please stay safe, be kind to one another, and come aboard again to another episode. And to be perfectly honest, that style of ending, that little blurb, is in connection to somebody who recently passed away in the last few days. So if you can just indulge me for one moment. Jerry Springer, the host of the notorious Jerry Springer Show, would have a moment at the end of every single show that he had. Every ounce of chaos that would erupt on this show would all come down to this moment, what was known as Jerry's final thought. And it's where he would summarize everything that you've seen on his episode of that show, which was just the trashiest of people possibly on television ever, coming together on a daytime talk show, and fights would ensue, and the crowds would erupt, and it was all for television. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, at the end of all of that chaos that would erupt on the show, Jerry would sit down with the audience and have a summarization of how we could take what we've heard today and move on from it or spin it into a positive. Not necessarily the content, but just the overall feelings. And he would end this final thought in a signature sign-off, which was so poignant. And from someone who would watch Jerry Springer with his stepfather a lot growing up, this was something that was engrilled in my psyche. So when I was getting into podcasting and getting into signing off on the radio when I was doing radio in college, this kind of thing that Jerry would do, I always tried to emulate. So thank you, Jerry, for giving me even a small tool that I have used and will continue to use for the rest of my career. Anytime I'm in front of a microphone, a camera, I understand that no matter what chaos may ensue, what happens, it's always that final thought that may resonate the most with people. Jerry Springer, age 79, would always end his show like this. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Thank you, Jerry. Now that's not a way to celebrate the guy. Come on, Griffin. Come on, Jake. Jerry, 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 Jerry.
See, you're not a king, and now they all think so. Oh.